Just 25 years ago, that's in 1963, BBC put out a remarkable film. Written and produced by Don Howarth, at the time a colleague of mine in Panorama, it sought to foretell the future, what life would be like 25 years on, and how people would look back over those 25 years from the year 1988. The film was called Time on Our Hands because it was thought that the dominant feature of life today would be leisure. They could be said to have got that half right and half wrong, as with many other of their forecasts, as I'm sure you'll agree when you've seen the film for yourself. After it, I'll be discussing with Don Howarth and two contributors to his film, Kingsley and Stafford, the predictions they and Don Howarth made in it. First, though, the 1963 production of Time on Our Hands, predicting life in Britain in 1988.
This is BBC Television.
It is 0830 hours, September the 14th, 1988. These are our time. They should live to be 100. They may colonize the stars. They will not toil. They need never be unhappy. This morning, as every morning, there is a problem. How to spend a golden lifetime. What to do with so much time. From this September morning in 1988, look back across a quarter of a century. This was London 25 years ago in 1963. And these were the days, so close to our own in time, so remote in style, when vast armies of human beings were still employed in offices and factories. Scenes like this, the rush hours as they used to call them, were not of course confined to London. But here their scale was greater because of the trend, reversed only a few years ago, to concentrate so much of the nation's business and of its population in the capital. Every working day in 1963, more than 1.25 million people poured into central London to work. Work, getting to work, getting back from work. This, for many people, was a large part of life 25 years ago. These were the years of the crawling motor car. In 1963, about 100,000 people drove to work in central London each day. Their number multiplied into a traffic engineer's nightmare. By the middle 60s, London was choked. Great traffic jams stretched through the city every morning and evening.
I mean, yesterday, I set out from Hounslow at 7 o'clock in the morning. By the time I got to Knightsbridge, they were all going home. Down at the works, they'd all gone except the security guard. They've all gone home, he says.
Why don't you use public transport?
I've got a bad back, you see. I can't afford to get mixed up in these punch-ups morning and night on the underground.
In April 1967, the morning rush hour and the evening rush hour had become one. This, the first of the great traffic jams of the 60s, took nearly a week to clear. Few motorists in 1967 had television in their cars. Only the most affluent were able to sit back and watch the historic first broadcast from the Russians on the moon.
61. Here in Red Square, there's tremendous excitement. It's been building up for hours. The square's packed with people, cheering, dancing, waving, clutching each other. They're even over in the corner there throwing the Red Army up in the air, I see, which is very unusual in Moscow. No one knows what we're going to see from the moon. We're told that we probably shall not see the Americans, who are established somewhere on the other side. No one minds what they see as long as they see something, and here are the first pictures on the television screens in the square now. The surface of the moon by television for the first time, and they're two members of the Soviet expedition. There must be three, one somewhere here behind the camera, in their space suits, moving weightlessly. What a fascinating sight to see this direct for the first time, across the face of a moon that looks, I must say, exactly as I, and no doubt you, thought it would look. Now already with these pictures down in Moscow again, and here in the square, they're going mad. The slogans are being brought through. What do they say? Thus, man breaks out from the narrow confines of his environment. We are the masters of unlimited space. We've begun the free and joyful journey to the ends of the universe.
of people rose above the turmoil, above a London which in 1968 banished the car to its outskirts, but still needed enormous armies of workers every day. People on their way up, but not yet airborne, spared themselves the struggles of daily travelling by moving their homes back from the suburbs into the city. Hitherto unfashionable districts closer to the office rose rapidly in esteem. The old houses remained and grew older. Their market values soared.
2 intimate reception rooms, 2 small but cosy bedrooms, convivial district, room for bath, £13,000.
A new type of resident had come to the East End. It was a long stride in those days around 1970 from the meanness of home, where the young executive left his wife, to the splendour of the office where he worked.
Our places of work become grander, shining and white and tall. We walk upon thick-piled carpets with fluorescent lights on the wall. We pass through a marble entrance as splendid as Pharaoh's tomb. We go back to our tiny terraces and then sleep 6 in a room. But it all may change tomorrow. The trend is perfectly clear. We'll work at home in the daytime and sleep in these offices here.
A city built on a river. Yet it was lack of water in the enormous quantities required by modern industry that ended London's growth and started the migration of industry to our new cities on the coast. A planning historian comments.
The move has been largely concentrated into the Welsh cities of Milford Haven and Holyhead, because in any case they were rapidly growing as deep-water ports. They are 2 of only 5 harbours in northern Europe capable of berthing bulk carriers and tankers of the 100,000-ton class. Even 25 years ago, Milford Haven had already been transformed from a quiet fishing harbour, but no one would then have guessed that today it would rival Rotterdam as one of the world's largest ports, and almost no one then foresaw what a splendid city Holyhead would become. This was one of the few towns in Britain where we were able to build free from the clutter inherited from the 19th and early 20th centuries.
It just used to be a little harbour for the boats going to Dublin. And over there, see, where the refineries are, there was nothing but fields and villages all the way down to Tridar Bay.
Of all the changes in these 25 years, the greatest has been in the way that people work. Back in 1963, and indeed for several years afterwards, acres of floor space were covered by human beings working away like the cells of a modern machine. Except in times of recession, the demand for these workers was endless, and the task they did endlessly repeated, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, perhaps for a whole lifetime. The patience of a saint, the manual dexterity of a juggler, the ability to shut off great areas of the mind. This was all that was asked of millions of people. The great reservoir of brain power that lay in this enormous labour force was almost untapped, and of the few who had the job of thinking, scarcely any foresaw the extent of the new industrial revolution that was to end scenes like this forever. Mechanization had, of course, already reached a highly advanced stage, but automation, the word that has made our world, remained just a word in many industrial organizations. Industry in 1963 was in fact a highly mechanized process in which human beings were used as extensions of the machinery. Production lines set the pace, and for the people on them, life went by in endless, the same task over and over again, hundreds, thousands, millions of times.
It's all going round and round, and I find that instead of me looking for the faults are looking for me.
The answer to tedium was tea, and when there was no tea, there was trouble. Yet few of these workers would have foreseen the technological revolution which was then impending as a means of liberation from monotony. When they thought about it at all, they were suspicious of it. So too were some of the most distinguished thinkers of the early 60s.
I think one can say that the whole history of recent times in relation to science and technology shows that if you plant the seed of applied science or technology, it proceeds to grow, and it grows according to the laws of its own being. And the laws of its being are not necessarily the same as the laws of our being. I mean, hence this sense of which so many people have, and which I think one sees in so many societies, the sense that man is being subjected to his own inventions, that he is now the victim of his own technology and the victim of his own applied science instead of being in control of it.
Workers everywhere around 1970 felt themselves victims of the new technology. Millions disappeared forever from the factory floor. Industrial plants began to take on their modern look. The human being was no longer a link in a mechanical process. The machines did the work. The men who remained supervised. By the early 1970s, a new kind of factory worker had emerged, the highly trained technician who passed his time with a bit of light reading and, by and large, left it to the computers to control the automatic processes of manufacture.
We measure the efficiency of our operation by the inactivity of these chaps. If they're bobbing about, we know that things aren't going too smoothly. That's what automation means, basically. Machines carrying through a whole series of operations by themselves without human intervention. That's why there's nothing like the same need for the skilled or semi-skilled chap on the factory floor.
But this had been foreseen, Sir John.
But at the same time, there are many more men behind the machines. Electronics engineers, designers, computer programmers, and so forth. The artisan has, in fact, been replaced by the technologist and the technician. We don't take on apprentices anymore. We get technically trained people from the universities.
What responsibility do you feel towards workers replaced in this way?
Every responsibility. We have our own training schemes, and ideally we should have turned them all into technicians. But with the best will in the world, there are problems of basic education, unadaptability, and so forth. After all, these chaps are getting the national salary for going through the motions of working a 3-day week. And if I was in their shoes, I'd settle down to enjoy my leisure, make the best of it, instead of kicking up against it.
If a 24-hour week is all that brilliant, why did that lot up there put themselves on a 24-hour week? All this leisure's all right for me and for you, but it's all right for them. They're up there working away 60, 70, 80 hours a week. We didn't ask for all this leisure, and we don't want it. 24 hours work a week. 1 day. 1 day shalt thou labour and do all thou hast. 1. And for the rest of the week you can stand about on the street corners or switch round and round the world on telly or go to hell for all they care. See this? From the government. How to make the best use of your leisure. Useful things to occupy yourselves with. Listen, I've decorated our premises through 6 times in the last 18 months. Every time a different colour. It's not like living in a house, as our old auntie said. It's like living in a kaleidoscope. They had 700 police at the launching platform last week controlling the crowd. 700, controlling a crowd of 100,000 people with nothing better to do than watch a string of rockets off to the moon. Grown men. Half of them turned out every morning by their wives, and everyone over 40 scared stiff of dying because they haven't got enough to do.
The agreement with the employers for a 24-hour week was agreed to by this union on a democratic mandate from its membership. And we shall make no attempt to reopen negotiations with the employers until the men, on an agreement already agreed to, and peacefully return to leisure.
For millions of us, these were the years of an obstinate losing struggle against the authorities and against a new industrial revolution, which was to bring undreamt of freedom and prosperity, but by means of painful steps. Everywhere around 1970, lines of men shuffled through the employment exchanges, men displaced by automated systems and unable to adapt themselves to different kinds of jobs.
I take this job I had at the Sunken Galleon.
Where?
The Sunken Galleon. One of these nightclubs, all done up like a pirate ship, you know. They give them the bill in doubloons, make the birds walk the plank, all that sort of caper. The boss told me straight. He said, as far as taking people's money is concerned and feeding them, a machine can do that as well as you can. He said, your job is to make people feel welcome on board, supply the human touch. Well, I did my best. I was brought up to work. I don't like drawing the national salary for doing nothing.
You want a chance to work for it?
Quite. My face ached with being civil to people, remembering all the names and so forth. It's the kind of strain you don't know unless you've experienced it. It's a lot worse than work.
Those extracts from television programs made 18 years ago in 1970 give a fair glimpse of the incredible situation we had got ourselves into. Many people were virtually pensioned off. Many more were miserably occupying themselves in meaningless jobs. It's really astonishing that nobody in the early 60s had the foresight to understand that the new technological revolution would demand all sorts of new skills. But if you look back over the records of the period, 1962, 63, 64, you find a huge complacency. First, much of industry was busily congratulating itself on the introduction of new methods, which were already 30, if not 50 years out of date. Second, those who were aware of impending revolution, of the widespread use in industry of computers, of automatic control, and all that proceeded from it, completely underestimated the demand this would create for specially trained people. No one got down to the research which would have shown how the whole structure of employment would change, the completely new range of jobs that people would have to be trained to do. It's an amazing oversight by people who had seen in their own lifetimes technological progress create a whole range of new occupations, from electronic engineers to air hostesses. Even as late as 1970, we had people like that businessman we saw talking just now, speaking glibly about the men behind the machines, without the foggiest notion of all this meant in terms of research and development, and speaking of the great increase in leisure, not as a benefit we all share, but as a burden to be inflicted on a great mass of people dismissed as unemployable. In fact, we needed brainpower and skill at every level, and we were perilously late in reforming our system of education to provide it.
This great reform in British education was pungently reviewed at Cambridge last year by one of its oldest advocates.
25 years ago, English education was still limited by Victorian ideas. It was a system designed to reject people. Ability was thought of as a very fixed and limited quantity. At each stage, people were tested, and a majority were in fact rejected. Out of 100 children in 1962, Only 25 got a high school education, which today is general, and only 6 or 7 went on to the universities and professional colleges. The Americans and the Russians and many other countries were in fact leaving us behind. I think, looking back, that we were lucky that the demands of automation exposed the acute shortage of trained people in this country. In a modern industrial democracy, you need a generally trained and a generally skilled people. You cannot run it on an elite alone.
In the 8 years between 1970 and 1978, the number of students at university trebled. Everywhere, new universities sprang up. Swindon and Accrington, Ipswich and Huddersfield, Bournemouth and Stirling. This was the great forward march of the ferro-concrete universities. There was never a time when education at all levels was more keenly sought. Thousands of unemployed artisans returned to the schools, determined to equip themselves for modern life. In the peak year, 1974, more than 300,000 adults had gone back to school, not counting those who'd never left. For now, students began to specialize early in their career. And for the first time in Britain, many stayed to pursue their specialized training until they were over 30. Even today, when we can see its splendid results, this great tide of educational progress is still frowned upon by aging pedants. Professor Amis, for example, had this to say.
The destruction of British education over the last 25 years has been carried out fairly smoothly. The first step, back in the 1960s, was the establishment of these new universities, which set out to attract potential students by the offer of stimulating and profitable courses of study, which would teach them to, what was the phrase, make sense of the modern world, and get a good job at the end of it, of course. This advertiser's approach soon drove out stuffy Victorian ideas of universities as places where unprofitable things like history and literature and zoology could be studied and the knowledge of them added to. We now have a higher proportion of educated people than ever before in our history. Educated in the sense that they hold a university degree, can recite the names of the more important works of Freud as well as Shakespeare, and of D.H. Lawrence as well as Marx, and can chat interestingly on a wide range of topics for 2 minutes each. None of that narrow specialization, which was the curse of education in the old-fashioned sense. A few centers of learning still survive, in which the last academics circulate their manuscripts, as serious imaginative writers now have to do, and as was once done centuries ago in what used to be called the Dark Ages. But a society in which knowledge has got to be useful cannot for very long give a place to education.
However Professor Amis may despise the common run of conversation, never before have so many people spent so much time simply talking to each other.
Okay, yes, bye-bye. Do you see what I mean?
But this has really been the least of the changes that have happened in social and personal life during the past 25 or 30 years. Just think, for example, about marriage. In 1963, the average age at which people married was around 24. Now, it's under 18. Indeed, more than 2 million people in Britain today are grandparents by the time they are 40. People like school teachers were seeing the effect of these changes as long ago as 1974. Yet a great deal of consternation was caused by this headmaster's comments when the interview was first broadcast 14 years ago.
Well, come back and see us any time. That's a far more serious problem than catering for senior pupils, you know. That fellow's got a brain, but he's 16 and he's just got married. Like so many of them, he doesn't want to leave home and go to university.
Are you opposed to people getting married at 16?
The children are grown up at 12 or 13 now. They get the national salary scale at 16, and that's that. I don't think it's a particularly wise thing, if that's what you mean.
How much do the schools do? Is anything done in your school to discourage these early teenage romances?
teenage romances. It's a bit old-fashioned, isn't it? Well, they get married, have 1 or 2 children before they reach the age of 19, and that's that. There's no romance about it. No, the people that go in for romance, as you call it, are the senior pupils. Young grandparents with time on their hands. 40, that's the age for the grand passion nowadays.
13 years later, in 1987, the fickleness of the over-40s had become a simple matter of statistics.
Well, of course, there's more divorce among people between 40 and 50 than there are among all the other age groups put together. The economic ties that used to hold marriages together, well, they're all gone. The only tie now is the children. And when the children grow up, the marriage ends, people opt out. You see, we're rapidly getting to the stage where marriage will become simply a 20-year contract. And we'll think of the family not so much as a permanent group, but something more like a football team which has an identity, but its members change from time to time.
That was a comment made last year, 1987, in the television series The Self-Conscious Hour, in which ordinary people talk about themselves. They were asked to talk for 2 minutes each on the changes they'd seen in personal life.
One significant change has been the way old people have been progressively pushed out of everything. Admittedly, the age gap between one generation and the next is less, and you had those 5 young grandfathers running a 4-minute mile in Stuttgart last week. But it means nothing. There's been no coming together of generations, quite the opposite. Everything's changed so rapidly, technologically and socially, that the older people have nothing more to tell us. They have wisdom from old age anymore, just obsolescence.
I think the biggest change has been the way we've lost all sense of occasion. You hear old boys talking about what it used to be like going to the cup final or even going to a concert. And you realise this was something very big that they looked forward to and left a big impression for a long time afterwards. All that's gone. Nothing now really amounts to a big occasion, even for children. One small pleasure follows another. Life has become one long, faintly agreeable party, like the one we're playing at being at now.
I agree. I had a small technical part in the project that put video recordings within the means of everybody. And this seemed to be an immensely worthwhile thing, to make it possible for everyone to have a library of the world's greatest dramatic and musical works of art, all on tap, all the time. But looking at the results, I can't honestly think that this created any profound change in the spirit, except to make people sated. In everything, the business of losing is greater than the business of enjoyment.
Because people aren't an audience any longer. They're creative. Of course, the greatest change for women has been that for the first time ever, we've got spare time. I mean, 25 years ago, all women were drudges. They'd been fighting their wits by all this leisure. I mean, they could never have imagined this great flood of creative activity that we fill our time in with. I mean, take me. I try to work creatively at this job of being an ordinary person on television. I mean, what is it? 6 million women organized in painting clubs? Well, something good must come out of it in the long run. Of course, I'm not saying they're as good as the pictures done by a computer, but at least they're original.
I wonder whether basically anything has really changed at all. We live in exactly the same old moral dilemmas as people did 25 years ago. Nothing has been solved, although superficially it seems a great better, because we no longer worry about things, at least not in the way people used to worry. It may be true that life is a perpetual party now. It used to be a great deal worse. It used to be a perpetual anxiety. Bomb, money, health, countless trivial things. My parents, and everyone else I know of in that generation, never stopped worrying about one thing or another.
Certainly, it is a shock to see the careworn faces of 25 years ago. This old film shows a particularly grim scene. Saturday shopping at the end of a week's drudgery. But at any place, at any time, even in their fleeting moments of leisure, the people of the early 60s were worried people. Listen to these extracts from old interviews.
Well, I'm worried because I can't take my dog on buses in Sheffield. It's the only town in Sheffield where, in the country where you can't take your little dog on the bus.
Well, it's just the butter situation. 5 shillings a pound. Why should it be?
What about you, sir?
Well, the water.
What, you're worried about the water?
Yes, it's raining now, but there's not enough of it.
Well, I just been complaining that there's so much of it here.
Well, it's going in the beer, I think, at the local. I don't think it's coming into the proper place.
There's another problem which worries me too, and that's the fact that they're driving a trunk road through my farm.
I think that in the world today there's a lot of affluence. It's been 20 golden years, but in spite of all that material prosperity, I feel that things are still pretty bad in the way homes are broken up, juvenile delinquents, and prisons well filled.
Well, worried about my bird when I'm up in Sheffield and birds down in London.
What sort of bird?
Oh, you know, my girlfriend.
Oh, a girlfriend?
Yeah.
Oh, I see. But why are you worried about her?
Oh, I don't know. Might be going out with someone else.
Among the up-and-coming, anxiety was a prime qualification. People worried about everything. They even worried about the splendid future before them. And when there was nothing else to worry about, they worried because they were worried. The remedy was alcohol, a remedy by no means universally accepted, but nevertheless widely and liberally applied. In the Britain of the early 1960s, more than £1,000 million a year was spent on intoxicating drinks, almost as much as was spent on the nation's education, and far more than was spent on its health. Only few men of foresight gave thought to an alternative to drinking on this scale.
Sooner or later, we shall have to find some kind of substitute for the permitted drug, which is alcohol. I mean, well, it's quite clear that alcohol is incompatible with the automobile. I mean, in America, it is currently calculated that at least 50% of the 37,000 people killed each year by the automobile are killed by people under the influence of liquor. Well, I mean, if we can find a drug which doesn't incite people to drive their cars when they're in a state of incompetence, we've done a great deal. I mean, this, after all, traditionally, ethyl alcohol goes back to Noah. And I see no reason to suppose that the human ingenuity will not be able to find a better mind-relieving, mind-detensioning drug.
The breakthrough happened in 1973, the discovery of a new group of drugs that helped to make cheerfulness fashionable and normal.
Well, these drugs have been developed right through the 60s. What we did was to reduce side effects to a minimum proportion. And this at a time when well, millions of people were feeling very unsettled because of the rapid way in which life was changing and so on. I suppose really it was a question of moral sanction. You see, up to that time it had been perfectly all right to take drugs to bring yourself up to par. You know, tranquilizers when you were feeling upset and sleeping pills when you couldn't sleep and so forth. But it had been frowned upon to want to take drugs as a means of making yourself positively happy. Oh, I suppose many of us take these drugs these days. It's difficult to understand what all the fuss was about. Medically speaking, the elimination of infectious diseases and the development of regenerative methods of keeping people alive after some organic failure have been far more important. But still, we do take some small pride here in, well, in having done our bit to make people happy.
Even back in 1963, life was not without its gay moments. The annual holiday, the once-a-year Beano, was the one occasion when people managed to leave most of their cares behind. The infinite variety of the English holiday resorts was equalled only by the infinite uncertainty of the English weather. It it was to the Mediterranean that people turned in search of the sun and status. It is probably true to say that after the Second World War, 40 years ago, only the upper middle class made a regular habit of these foreign holidays. But the time was approaching when almost everyone, regardless of class, joined in the invasion of the beaches of the Mediterranean. By the early 1960s, the pursuit was on in earnest. All sorts of people streamed abroad. Typists and greengrocers, oxyacetylene welders and bookies clerks. Hot on the heels of exclusive people who were pushed farther and farther southward in search of a quiet, exclusive holiday. It was at the new resorts of North Australia that the rich and privileged found a respite from the crowd. But it didn't last. By the middle 1970s, everybody else was turning up there too. But by now, the distinctions of class had almost disappeared. We were all more or less of the same class. In recent years, since 1980, people of discrimination have returned to our own coast, preferring the hazard of a climate we are still unable to control to the crowds that mill incessantly on the sunny beaches of the world. Only one large group of people worked on through the 1970s untouched by the general increase in leisure, the businessmen. As recently as 1981, their working week averaged more than 65 hours. Endless conferences, endless journeys, always working, always in touch.
In that case, don't touch down at Hong Kong at all. Carry on to Rio. Sorry about that. Now, as I was saying, the business executive is about the hardest worked chap in the world. Look at these chaps of mine. They're strong, physically strong, big men. The young executive today either gets up in the organization or he gets out. He's required at certain ages to reach certain stages of promotion. For a man to stay the course till he's 40 is a quite honorable innings these days.
Why is it that so few technologists become company executives in this country?
Well, is it all that uncommon? I suppose one reason might be that they go to different universities and shoot off in a different direction altogether. They're very highly specialized chaps. In fact, their language is so specialized now as to be incomprehensible to anyone else. And even, I'm told, to technologists studying in different fields.
Your executives don't know what your technologists are saying?
Not in any detail. They don't need to. They're concerned with ends, not means. An advertising executive, for instance, is expected largely to concern himself with policy and staffing. He doesn't need to know how to program the computers that analyze market trends, write the copy, and so forth.
American firms who are experimenting with cybernetic systems say they can dispense with 80% of their executives.
It's the people who are selling cybernetic systems who say this. I hope they're right. But I suspect it'll be quite some time before we see a machine capable of equaling first-class human judgment.
This quaint notion is still widely held in business, though even the old computer systems years ago were far more efficient than the human brain at certain prescribed tasks. Automation really meant the use of computers, rather than the human brain, for the control of processes and systems. The new cybernetic machines go one step further. They can make judgments and can therefore solve policy problems. In fact, they simulate the human brain. That's what the word cybernation means. These cybernetic machines are connected to all parts of the factory all the time, so they always know in detail what's happening. They can absorb more facts than we can. They can remember them all, which we can't, and they can act on them instantaneously. They are geared 24 hours a day to the sole task of running a factory. The business conference is a crude attempt to achieve by human means this concentration of information and decision. But it's inefficient at transmitting information and laughably inadequate for taking decisions. The conference has had its day. We have reached the stage when factories can run themselves.
Several of the large companies that have decided against cybernation make the point that there's a safeguard in large numbers of people being concerned in decisions.
They're businessmen, of course, not scientists. They have an interest in being necessary. In fact, where a large number of people are involved, they become more concerned with the politics of personal power than in reaching right decisions. The components of a cybernetic machine, on the other hand, are not involved in competition with one another. It's not an electronic thing with lots of bits of wire coming loose. It's organic. An electronic brain to do this job would be the size of Yorkshire with so many billion interconnections you couldn't possibly make them.
All the information I require from the machine, summaries about what it's doing and so forth, come to me here. My voice is relayed to it over a simple electronic transducer, and back comes the answer, or what I want to see.
What kind of economy has there been in staff?
Oh, not very much. The only way you can try out a new machine is to build it, and you can't make prototypes on a production line. You need the old-fashioned skilled worker. There aren't nearly enough, and of course they have their own traditions. They're smoking cigarettes, as you can see. And they drink beer in their spare time. They make about £100 a week. They insist on a group of 3, although the chap sitting down, their lad, hasn't to touch the materials, and the other man standing by the grinder mustn't actually operate. And we do employ a large number of technologists on design and improvement.
How much further can this process of cybernation go?
I don't know. Theoretically, we may be able to build machines that invent machines more complex than themselves, far beyond human understanding.
It's a rather frightening prospect.
Oh, I don't know. Human beings are infinitely adaptable. Look at the way people have taken completely new jobs this past 20 or 30 years. Look at the change even in the sort of image we have of ourselves. 20 years ago, we were a nation of honest toilers. Now, I suppose, most of us see ourselves as rather dashing men of leisure.
Tumbling about the sky by day, gaming for small fortunes by night. This life of fun and games, underwritten by permanent security, could scarcely have been imagined 25 years ago. Now we have it, large groups of us don't want it. The young people, the children of the Teddies and the Beats, who've shocked everybody with their puritanism.
See, my dad's always on to me. Why don't you break out, he says. I was a delinquent when I was half your age. Well, I mean, what is there to break out against?
Well, take crime like his dad went in for. These police have got these electronic systems now that they know what's going to happen in advance. And they're ready there waiting for you, all smiles, and ready to take you down to the nearest psychiatrist.
You can't go wrong, you see. It's just not real living. People won't get married until they've fed their factors into a marriage computer and got it compatible. It's taken all the fun out of it.
I mean, my dad's a bit screwed up. He grew up in the 60s, but he's done things in his own sort of warped way.
You can get drugs out of these machines here which can give you a bigger experience than going around Mars or Venus. They've got the cosmonauts to say so. But when all's done and finished, you haven't been around Mars or Venus. You've just been sitting here sucking a pill.
I'm not against taking drugs for enjoying sensations, but I disagree with pickling yourself into a permanent state of happiness. Because, well, to be really happy, you've got to be unhappy sometime.
It's not a proper human life.
What do you mean by a proper human life?
I don't know. You can't define it. Whatever it is, we've been done out of it.
Among older people, the protest has not been against too little life, but against too much.
Well, I don't think it's right the way we keep our old folk doddering on until they're over 90. It may be an advertisement for medical science, but it's not kind. My old uncle has been brought back from the brink so many times in the past 18 months that the old gentleman doesn't know whether it's coming or going. Do you know there are over 5 million people in this country who are too old and senile to look after themselves? When a man loses his faculties, the kindest thing the doctors and medical engineers can do is to stand aside and let him slip off decently.
Every year since 1975, postulants by the tens of thousands have streamed into monasteries, seeking a life now impossible outside of austerity, contemplation, quietness. This has been called the silent protest of our time. Other young men have gone away to join the colonies of scientists on the planets. Their protest has been more explicit.
To me as a geologist, the work itself out there is terribly exciting. I suppose it is why I'm going really because of the fun. Down here now, the risk, the anxiety, the adventure's been taken out of everything. Very few of us are at full stretch anymore. We're only just about half alive most of the time. I'm glad to be going. And I think there'll be some pretty envious faces watching me go.
With me now are three of the people who were responsible for making those predictions. Don Howarth, who made the film, and two of its contributors, Kingsley Amis and Stafford Beer. Kingsley, you appeared as a bearded professor. I didn't recognize you.
No, it was a very temporary beard. It only lasted that day. I never was a professor, really.
You weren't?
Only in America. Everybody's a professor there.
And Stafford Beer, you weren't a professor either then, but you are now.
That's right, 1969.
Of cybernetics at Manchester Business
Correct.
School. Don, how did the idea... I mean, first of all, let me say it's a marvelously crafted film, and you had a super lot of actors. We were all absolutely riveted here watching it. How did the idea of the film originate?
Well, it wasn't my idea, Ludo. It came from Donald Baverstock, who was then assistant controller of BBC Television. And he complained that he was being offered documentaries always about the present or the past. Why don't we do one about the future? So I saw a few people and got some ideas together, which greatly excited him. Then he began to bother, what are we going to see on the screen? If we're not careful, he said, in his usual engaging way, we're going to finish with a crowd of charlatans sitting around prognosticating. And indeed, there is a problem. The future in its nature is not there to be photographed. And we thought further about it and hit upon the idea of doing it as a retrospect, which solves the problem of images and enable us to strike a lighter note, more in keeping with the frivolity of the subject.
Well, now, Don, looking back at it now, 25 years on, what is your reaction?
Well, I'm touched by the point you've made that this beard with which we fixed up Kingsley has not come to fruition in all these years.
But Stafford's has.
Stafford did. I think that, you know, accomplished for Kingsley of a beard.
But looking back on,
yes.
on the film, I mean, do you feel proud of having made that film?
Well, you know, there are parts of it that are okay. The main thesis, that work would increase to the extent that leisure lay heavy on people's hands, didn't actually come off. There are more people now at work. Since the film was made, a whole generation of married women have turned themselves out to work. And I think the before us is greater now than it's ever been.
Yes, it was. Stafford, what did you think of it?
Well, I was absolutely delighted with it. I think, you know, given 25 years, I don't think we could have been more accurate. I think very much...
Well, wait a minute. We'll come to that in a moment.
Well, wait a minute. I think, you know, Donna's just said that, well, we got the letter wrong, but leisure is now called unemployment. We have more unemployed than we've ever had.
Well, before we get into the details, I mean, did you think, looking back on it, that was a jolly good film, that was worth making?
I did.
What did you feel, Kingsley?
Well, I loved it. I loved all the pontificating businessmen were marvellous. And the vox pops were terrifically well acted and well directed, too, I thought. And the hesitations and interruptions and so on. But I think I should sound a less agreeable note. I thought one thing that struck me was that it's very entertaining, but the prophecies were a bit old-fashioned in a way, and the material, so to speak, is a bit old-fashioned. I mean, the first thing we saw really was all the traffic being held up. Well, people have been prophesying that ever since I can remember. I did a précis at school in 1935, which the first sentence was, "We are overrun by the motor car." And when I first came to live in London, in 63, they were saying, oh, well, it can't go on like this, you know. I mean, you do realise, I mean, they have no private cars in London. Any moment. It's still any moment.
One of the things, of course, you've got absolutely right, was the move back into unfashionable areas in London of businessmen. I mean, Islington and Stockwell and places like that. So that was spot on. So that was good. What about automation? I think it was obvious that automation was coming,
been coming for a very long time again. I mean, it's in Huxley's own
It wasn't
works
too difficult to prophesy that, really, was it? But you, of course, go further, Stafford, don't you? You said in the film, I mean, I think you said that you thought that cybernetic machines would be running factories 24 hours a day in 1988.
Well, they are in many countries in the world. And not in Britain. That's what I made my mistake. I really believed that British management could rise to this, and it hasn't. That's my big problem.
Well, what about, I'll tell you one thing you did say. You were so bold to suggest that there were no more business conferences. The conference, you said, has had its day, and I suppose there are more conferences today than there ever been before.
Depends which part of the world you're in. I work mainly in North and South America, and this is certainly coming true. We are working through real-time systems of interaction where these ghastly meetings round boardroom tables are no longer taking place, and England is about 20 years behind, I would say.
Well, a lot of the conferences, of course, are subsidised holidays, really,
Absolutely.
so-called conference facilities at every university, every hotel you come to, and they're just having a good fitting in their leisure.
Yeah, but that happens a lot in America, too. I mean, you go to America, every hotel has got a conference.
Of course it has, but the real question is where is the control actually exerted? And it's being exerted through computers, which I would have called cybernation, which is the use of the computer to amplify mental abilities. And that is now universal. It's right round the globe.
You don't hear the word cybernation much these days. You used to hear it when Don made the film.
I was wrong about the word, no doubt.
Yeah.
Yes.
It did seem from what Stafford had said that a high degree of productivity would be achieved, and that this necessarily would mean that people work for a shorter period of time, or that there is a great volume of production to which there must be a limit. There must be a limit of consumption. And so we adduced from that there would be long periods of leisure. What I think was also apparent, and I think what came out in the film, is that this is not really a very desirable thing. People don't want a great deal of leisure. When I was doing the research, I went to see George Woodcock, who was General Secretary of the TUC at that time, and he said he could never foresee a time when people would prefer leisure to more money. And indeed, I think that is true. And there seems to be a fear of leisure. It isn't only a question of going on working for the money, it's a question of really bothering about what is going to happen in all the time when people are released from work, so that very often, not so much among manual workers, but among professional people, retirement is regarded with apprehension as a sentence rather than a release.
I think a lot of the fear of so-called leisure is the fear of being at home and being expected to help round the house, don't you? That's why there's one good reason for wanting to stay at work, both during the day and the week and after retirement days.
See, this comes back to the question of retraining, because our generation grew up with the idea that if they weren't working, they were somehow morally culpable. Instead of being told that, what a release, now we can do everything. You can go to the Himalaya and hunt butterflies, you can meditate, you can do all sorts of wonderful things. Nobody's being taught this to this day.
Isn't it also a feeling of not being wanted?
Oh, yeah.
Isn't it very much that feeling that we have stayed
surely,
home?
Ludo, that's because the want is focused on an institution and not on being a member of the cosmos. That's where we're losing out.
Yes, but work does give an identity.
Quite.
And identity has been diminished in other ways. I think there's been an increase over this time in loneliness. That people, more people live alone, and even within the family circle, people get a great deal less attention than they did, because the attention is taken by the electronic gadgets.
Of course, one of the things you didn't, I mean, in talking about this leisure, you didn't, you suggested there were 6 million women in painting clubs all over the country. But you didn't suggest at all, in fact, you had no inkling, I think, of the kind of role that women was about to fall on women. I mean, enormous workforce, and then women's lib and important jobs, reading the news, all sorts of things which they've come into since 1962. That was something you didn't foresee.
Oh, not at all. Yeah. Not at all. I mean, I think we saw some figure, didn't we, the other day, that something like 1 million women or more have gone back into the workforce or joined it for the first time. And that certainly was not foreseen then, no.
There's a tremendous factor in here which we didn't recognize, which I think is very, very important, which is that the economy would work in such a way that unless women worked, then the family would no longer be viable. And that is what's happened, led by the United States. 70% of the women are working in the United States, and if they were not, their families would be kaput. And it's closely following that in England, it seems to me.
The other thing, just while we're on the subject, which is extraordinary, in a way, you said not only there would be this enormous amount of leisure, but people would cease to worry. Now, there's been no time in human history, as far as I'm aware, where human beings didn't worry about something. And if once they'd satisfied themselves in one way, then they'd start worrying about something else. Right. So I wondered why you... Sorry.
Is it too late for me to make an elitist remark and say that people aren't qualified by their intelligence and so on to do any leisure? They're qualified to do rather boring and elementary work. I mean, if you go in, millions to the theatre and to read and so on and to listen to music, they'll find there's nothing in it.
There's nothing the way they've been brought up to the rational days to listen to
organisation. Mostly music, aren't they? So I should be in it better than people on the fringes. I don't think you can make millions.
I'm sorry, I disagree. I think it's the way people are taught.
Let me just get back to you, Don. I was asking you about, before I was so rudely interrupted, I was just asking you about your theory that people would cease to worry, and that was odd, I thought.
Yes, well, it is wrong, completely wrong. I've come now to the conclusion that anxiety is a permanent state, which merely attaches itself to different causes.
Oh, yeah. And Huxley thought that a drug would be found, rather than alcohol, in which would alleviate our concerns and worries. Of course, he'd taken mescaline at the time, hadn't he? But do you think he was foreseeing mescaline, Valium, LSD, or was he couldn't have been foreseeing heroin and cocaine?
Well, he can't have foreseen that, Ludo. I mean, he recommended drugs like someone suggesting a superior brand of tea.
Yeah. Which is Valium. I think that the combination of Valium and soap opera has more or less vindicated Huxley, frankly. I do not believe that the mass of people are full of anxiety. Disagreement?
No. But I
think you were right in the first place.
But I mean, when Huxley said this thing about drugs, it struck a great chord, because I mean that's what we read in the papers now, happening all the time, is the dependence on drugs and all the dangers of it.
Not many. The number of drug addicts, though, is quite small, isn't it?
Yes.
It's rather sort of a floating population. I mean, how many would you say, Stafford?
Well, it's the thing I was just talking about, is the mass of the people, which is what I think Huxley was talking about. He's dead, he can't answer for himself, but I talked to him. His idea of soma, as you reminded me in Brave New World, was of something that made people feel that everything was sort of okay, what Aristotle called eudaimonia. And here we are, most people do feel that, I think. And that's why we can't, and we agree on that, get them interested in high music, high drama, and all the great wonders of life.
Well, you think they're too drugged to appreciate it?
I think so, yes.
Oh, well.
I'm sorry, now I'm being elitist, I suppose.
But you see, here Kingsley and Stafford rather come to blows, because, as I understand it, Kingsley, you thought that more and more higher education would be vocational to the detriment of academic excellence. And Stafford, you were concerned that there wouldn't be enough vocational education for all the jobs that had to be done.
Yes, I was then, but I've reversed places by now. Because
well, I think it's exactly
all our education is elitist in the sense that it's vocational. After all, we have more or less halved our departments of philosophy in this country in the last 7 years. I mean, it's just unbelievable. So I defer to Kingsley here, but it's quite odd how the words have changed.
Yeah, I mean, there are two things you can have instead of education. Well, many things. But two of them as pernicious are vocational training, which we've been talking about, and the other, of course, is social engineering. and non-subjects like sociology, social studies, and anthropology, of anthropometrics, and various dilutions of sciences, physics studies instead of physics, which is lives of the great physicists, really. But the one that has receded rather, I think, is the second lot. I think that vocational training is knocking off social engineering, and also, in the process, education itself. That's to say, as I try to define it, a disinterested pursuit of truth, no matter where the inquiry may lead.
I must say I've come to agree with you much more, because what we are apparently doing is devoting ourselves to the training of people to do the things we know about. Whereas what we have to do is train people to do the things we don't know about, which are happening so fast. Would you agree
Find
with that?
out. Yes, well,
It's
find out
interesting
what
if
there is
after
to find
20
out.
years you and I actually agree.
But what you said, Stafford, was that you said that there would not be enough vocational education for all the jobs that had to be done. Now, how is that today?
Well, this is still true, isn't
Still
it?
true. I don't know.
Absolutely still true. I mean, we have to go all over the world to get technical techies, as they're known in the States, technical experts. Well, half are unemployed, are incapable of doing the job. Well, I think that's tragic.
Kingsley, you also said in a memo which I read to Don, you said you thought that fewer and fewer books would be published, when in fact there have been more and more.
I know. I wish I'd been right about that. But I was right, I think, in the same memo when I said that the author, the right book, will recede in importance, and he'll be replaced by a sort of committee. There will be a nominal author who goes around being interviewed and opening things and signing copies. And the book will actually be put together in the publisher's office with the assistance of an agent and, of course, a publicity director and so on. I think that is happening. I think the amount of actual authorship that goes on is declining quite fast.
Edited by, you mean?
Yes, as told
absolutely,
too. Yes.
You also said, Kingsley, that you thought, this was a curious thing, you said you thought that painters would paint their pictures, but not for show, that they might burn them afterwards.
Oh, that was just a wild hope.
Yeah. I've been reading some of the replies, Don, from people you wrote to while you were preparing the film, and some do make glorious reading. A man called John Maddox, who was he?
Oh, he was science editor of the Guardian.
Of the Guardian, that's right. Well, he said that all viruses were on the way out, and that by 1988, half of all those over 65 would be dotards.
Wasn't he the editor of Nature?
Yes, he was the editor of Nature later, yes.
Yes, well, that's one of the things he said.
Yes, well, it's not really illustrable, except unkindly.
That's right, no. And a BBC employee called Birkinshaw, whose name I vaguely remember, I think he was an engineer, wasn't he?
Yes, he was a distinguished
chief engineer.
yes.
He thought we would just about have colour TV this year.
Yes, that's right.
If we remember.
And in strictly controlled conditions.
In strictly controlled conditions. And also, somebody else said the top people would all live in Ireland and fly here by helicopter, and that all Irishmen would come and work here. And Bernard Lovell, the astronomer, thought that there would be trips to the moon and the planets by now. So, you see, in a way, it seems to me that you can predict perhaps 5 or 10 years ahead.
Yeah.
But you can't really predict much longer than that. Would you agree with that, Stafford?
Isn't it a question of saying that the predictions are pretty accurate, but after a little time, you get the time scale wrong?
Yes.
After all, everything we said in that program has happened.
It's like the weather forecast, isn't it?
A bit like that. You get the hurricane 2 years later. And that's too bad in practical terms, and I don't defend it in that way. But it has always seemed to me that human imagination as to what is possible remains only a very short time ahead. You think of Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, it's all happened. We have Nautilus, the submarine, we have the whole works. It's just a question of getting the timing right, which unfortunately matters very much.
Yes, but you can't go beyond a certain period with any degree of conviction at all, because you don't know what's going to be invented 10 years from now, do you?
You can't foresee the problems. You may foresee the developments of existing problems.
That's right.
And an awful lot got left out. Perhaps you're coming to that.
Yes. Well, let's talk, Kingsley, about things that weren't mentioned.
Well, one thing that was hardly mentioned was television is the most amazing thing. Leisure was talked about for a long time, and illuminatingly, but nobody said, as far as I noticed, that we'd spend more and more hours in front of the televisions, and even they're supposedly employed.
There were those rich people at the back of the Rolls-Royce who were looking at a set watching the landing on the moon. Do you remember that?
Yes, that was just a gadget.
But there was a moment when somebody said nobody foresaw that everybody would have access to wasn't television, to recorded visual images, something like that.
Videotape.
Yes, and you know, that was spot on. Yes.
Yes, but a much bigger slice of our time, everybody's time, is taken up with actual television as we knew it then.
That could be so, Mark Kingsley, you see, that could be so much.
What was missing was any kind of reference to the growth of pop culture. The film that I made after this was about the Beatles, and that was perhaps more prophetic than this one, because that has changed the sound and sight of life, I think.
Yeah. And you saw that, Kingsley, in your memo. You talked about the growth of pop culture.
Yes, God forgive me, I saw that as quite a good and interesting thing then.
That's right.
But of course I didn't realise how low things would sink. I mean, to appeal to everybody, it's got to appeal at a jolly low level.
The film was fairly confident, wasn't it? I mean, people at that time looked ahead and they thought things, on the whole, would be much the same, but they'd get better.
Yes, that's right.
That's really
right. Yes.
More interesting.
And I don't think we feel that now, do we?
That was my biggest mistake.
Do we? Yes. Do we feel that now?
I felt optimistic, and I don't any longer.
No.
Well, you're much
Well, I think there's more reason to feel optimistic now than there was 25 years ago.
Really?
I don't.
About what?
Well, I think the international situation is brighter. It's not terribly bright, but at least it is brighter. There is sort of...
Since Glasnost?
Yes, that's right. I mean, that's the thing we can't predict. What's going to happen in 6 months, we don't know, let alone in 25 years.
We couldn't have predicted Glasnost 5 years ago.
No,
right. I would like to say that I'm still optimistic internationally, but pessimistic in Britain, because Sir John is still our top manager from that film.
Just for fun, if the four of us were asked to say what we would predict for the year 2013, which I guess is 25 years from now, what would we say? What would you say, Stafford?
Well, I think the world economy will be centred in the Pacific Rim. I think England will be more or less dead, most of Europe, all of North America. The whole economic scene is just going kaput. So the Pacific Rim is going to pick that up. I think that will then fund Latin America and India and Africa. And gradually there will be a switch round there.
Well, that's
enough.
That's enough.
Okay.
Kingsley, what would you say?
Well, looking nearer home, I'd say two things possibly. One is I don't think people are going to go out much anymore, stay at home and consume, and watch television of a grander and height of spirituality we can't imagine. And I think, or perhaps it's just what I hope, that making any unnecessary noise will be very heavily punishable, if necessary by instant imprisonment.
Good. Don?
Yes, I would stick to the prediction of the film, which didn't come true over these 25 years. I would think that in the next 25 years, it is going to happen that work will diminish and that people will have a great deal of leisure, and this will be seen in the first place, and for 10 years at least, as a very great problem.
Thank you all very much.